This is the paper 2 English literature section B, which is our anthology. For us, that is the conflict section. So as we get going, I want to think just a little bit about poetry. And my first tip for you really is try not to get overwhelmed with the fact it's a poem. At the end of the day, it's a piece of text and you are more than used to analysing that. So we're looking for those techniques. We're looking for things like our figurative language, our structural comments that we're going to make, such as how do the beginning and endings link. We're looking for similes, metaphors, those key words, adjectives, nouns, verbs, and how they affect the reader. But there's some terminology that might help you along the way. So thinking about how we talk about our poems, remembering that the paragraphs in a poem are called a stanza. So the groups of lines that are together are stanzas. Enjambment is where the sentence goes across either two or more lines or sometimes across the stanzas. So it's the fact that the lines run across multiple, the sentences run across multiple lines. The opposite to enjambment is caesura. So that's where a pause occurs within the line of the poetry. So it's usually with some sort of full stop, a comma, an ellipsis, or a dash that indicates a break in the sentence in the middle of the line. We have a refrain, which is specific to our poetry here. That's a word, phrase, or line that repeats at regular intervals. So think about some of those poems that you know, such as I am not the problem, or excuse me, or what do you mean, or I'm proud of the class that I come from, or why does it matter what class you come from. They're refrains. We also see it in exposure, so but nothing happens. They're what we called refrains. We've then got anaphora, which is a figure of speech in words which repeats at the beginning of successive clauses, phrases, or sentences. Sorry about the formatting there. Talking a little bit about rhyme schemes. So we talk about regular rhyme schemes. So that's where there might be a consistent pattern. You don't need to sit and work out what that pattern is. You can literally just say a regular rhyme scheme to make your point. A bit like when I say to you, don't just say it's got long or short sentences. Don't just say that it's got an A-B rhyme scheme if you're not going to say anything about it. It's talking about the effect that has on the reader that's important. Blank verse is unrhymed poetry written in iambic pentameter. So the Prelude, for example, is written in blank verse. And then we've got free verse, which doesn't follow any regular meter or rhyme scheme. So we've got in our poems in the anthology, we've got our regular rhyme schemes, our blank verse, and our free verse poems. And then one just to think about at the end there, which you will be familiar with from Macbeth, is this idea of rhyming couplets. So that's where two lines rhyme together to form a complete thought. For your Easter homework, then you have been asked to have a look at this question. So in the paper, it says, reread Cousin Kate, choose one other poem from the conflict anthology and compare how strong feelings are presented in the two poems. And then the reminders, you should consider the poet's use of language, form and structure and the influence of the context in which the poems are written. This is 20 marks, so it's the same as your Jekyll and Hyde Part A and your Jekyll and Hyde Part B, which add up to 40 marks in total. You've then got this anthology question, which is 20 marks, and then the final section in the next video where you will have your unseen poetry, which is worth 20 marks. So a reminder of the poems that you've studied, which you'll get in the exam. You'll get the copy of the list of the poems. Obviously, the poems themselves won't be printed, but you've studied A Poison Tree, The Destruction of Sennacherib, Extract from the Prelude, The Man He Killed, Cousin Kate, Half Caste, Exposure, The Charge of the Light Brigade, Katrin, War Photographer, Belfast Confetti, The Class Game, Poppies, No Problem, and What Were They Like? My top tips for you is to think very carefully about the poems that you've revised well and which will fit the theme of the question. The beauty of this question is that it talks about strong feelings, and all of the poems have got strong feelings in them. They don't have to be directly similar, but the poems that you choose must address the question. And remember that you must talk about context as well. In the exam then, you will have the named poem printed. So let's just read that quickly together. This is Cousin Kate by Christina Rossetti. I was a cottage maiden, hardened by sun and air, contented with my cottage mates, not mindful I was fair. Why did a great lord find me out, and praise my flaxen hair? Why did a great lord find me out, to fill my heart with care? He lured me to his palace home, woes me for joy thereof, to lead a shameless, shameful life, his plaything and his love. He wore me like a golden knot, he changed me like a glove. So now I moan, an unclean thing who might have been a dove. O Lady Kate, my cousin Kate, you grew more fair than I. He saw you at your father's gate, chose you and cast me by. He watched your steps along the lane, your sport among the rye. He lifted you from mean estate to sit with him on high. Because you were so good and pure, he bound you with his ring. The neighbours call you good and pure, call me an outcast thing. Even so I sit and howl in dust, you sit in gold and sing. Now which of us has tenderer heart, you had the stronger wing? O cousin Kate, my love was true, your love was writ in sand. If he had fooled not me but you, if you stood where I stand, he'd not have won me with his love, nor bought me with his land. I would have spit into his face, and not have taken his hand. Yet I've a gift you have not got, and seem not like to get. For all your clothes and wedding ring, I've little doubt you fret. My fair-haired son, my shame, my pride, cling closer, closer yet. Your sire would give broad lands for one to wear his coronet. As ever, we are going to use our EDAC structure to tackle this poem. The poem question is, how are strong feelings presented? And if we have a look at these opening lines, we can see that the poem begins with a reflective tone. The past tense was is coupled with the adjective contented, which suggests that actually the speaker of Cousin Kate, the speaker was happy with her life. So the poem establishes this reflective nature where the speaker is thinking about how she was happy in the past. She was living a nice rural life. However, the repeated interrogative, why did, further establishes the reflective tone, but introduces a sense of bitterness and anger. Why did a great lord find me out? Why did a great lord find me out? So the repeated interrogative there, showing this sense of bitterness and anger. It's then developed, this sense of anger and bitterness is developed through the verb lured, which suggests that she's been tricked, that she's been almost like a prey to the Lord's predatory nature. And she's been lured to his palace home, where she was made a plaything. Okay, the hate and the wrath that the speaker feels through the repetition, as she explains how she was a plaything, how she was worn by him, how he changed her. And the repeated pronoun he really shows that this strong feeling is directed towards the Lord. He is the problem here. And those strong feelings really beginning to ramp up as this poem develops. And then she compares herself to how she was treated compared with this Lady Kate, her cousin, where she talks about how the Lord saw and watched and ultimately lifted the cousin to higher places. The juxtaposition here emphasizing this bitterness that she feels towards her cousin. So in terms of how the poem amplifies these strong feelings, you saw on the previous slide I've highlighted a couple of sentences in green, and there's a couple here as well. So we're looking here at the strong feelings being amplified through the semantic field of misery. So the speaker describes how she moans and how she howls, revealing her sorrow and anger at the situation. And furthermore, she dehumanizes herself by referring to herself as a thing. Now I moan, an unclean thing. And the misery is amplified further as this reflective tone from the beginning is coupled with this idea of how she was contented, but now she's sitting in the dust, she's howling, she's an outcast, and she leads a shameless, shameful life. A really important moment to reflect on with this idea of shame. Later on, I'm going to link this to context for you with the sense of the fallen woman from the Victorian era. So we're looking at the gender expectations in the Victorian era, where if you had sex outside of marriage, you would be outcast from society. You would be deemed to be impure, which is what here Rossetti is reflecting on. So as the poem concludes, there is a real shift in the tone from what has been quite an angry and bitter poem. Whilst that's still there, there's a sense of finality here with a glee and delight in the way that things have worked out. the speaker uses the pronouns you and your to contrast her situation with her cousin's and the fact that she has a gift that the cousin doesn't have. She talks about her son, my fair-haired son, my shame, my pride, as something which her cousin seems likely not to get. The fact that she has this child is something that the Lord would really, really want. Your sire would give broad lands for one. The fact that actually to have an heir in the Victorian era was incredibly important. She directly addresses her cousin here, instructing her to cling closer, closer yet, because her situation would have been very precarious. To have not had a child in wedlock means that she's not fulfilled her duty as a woman. And if we think about Macbeth, we saw this with Lady Macbeth and her obsession with needing to provide Macbeth with an heir. And we still see this quite prevalent in the Victorian era. So the fact that the cousin hasn't managed to have a son, it would have been really, really significant. And this is where we see the speaker's quite malevolent tone here. It's very sinister as the poem concludes with this delight that she feels that she has something that her cousin doesn't have. Now, I've mentioned context a few times, so I've just got a little bit here for you, so you can pause the video and have a look. But Rossetti published this dramatic monologue in 1862. And in 1862, she was volunteering at the St. Mary Magdalene House for Fallen Women. So fallen women was a derogatory 19th century term for unchaste women, such as unmarried mothers or women who have had sex outside of marriage. Ironically, there is not a similar term for men. This is just about women and their expectations. And the gender biases created starkly different social expectations for men and women. Okay, at the same time, women were taught to be submissive towards men in their lives, but then when they were used for sex, they were then outcast. So sort of a bit of a catch-22, really. The speaker in the poem obediently submits herself to the sexual desires of the powerful lord, as would be expected, because she doesn't have a say in it. Yet in doing so, she becomes a social outcast. So the poem really implies the kind of hypocrisy of the gender ideals of the Victorian era. They are conflicting and they burden women with an impossible situation. They have to both obey and resist the much more powerful men in their lives. So this poem really reflecting those kind of tensions and perhaps conveying Rossetti's strong feelings, linking back to the poem's question, the strong feelings she has about this hypocrisy within the Victorian era. Reminding ourselves of the exam question then, reread Cousin Kate and choose one other poem from the conflict anthology. Compare how strong feelings are presented. So as I reminded you earlier, here are the list of poems that you have studied. You're lucky because all of them have strong feelings in them. But my personal recommendations to match with this poem would be A Poison Tree, which is about anger, Extract from the Prelude, which is about awe and the power of nature, The Class Game, which is about pride and how prejudice affects people, Poppies, looking at the prevalence of sadness connected with war, what were they like with the regret and the fear and the anger, and then Catherine for the more familial memory and anger, which connects really well. For the sake of this video, I'm going to have a look at the Prelude because that hasn't come up in the exam before, so it's a nice opportunity to go through a poem that could potentially be your printed poem. Let's just remind ourselves of Extract from the Prelude then. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point, with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan, when from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars. And still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I'd left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen the spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being over my thoughts. There hung a darkness. Call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, move slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. Thinking about EDAP then, let's have a look at how these ideas of strong feelings are established. So it begins with quite a calm and peaceful tone at the start here. The summer evening, the little boat, the willow tree, all make the description seem safe, as the usual home offers this sense of protection. However, there's also a sense of foreboding established in contrast with this calm summer's evening. The rocky cove and mountain echoes convey a sense of kind of a hidden danger. The speaker talks about how the sailing was an act of stealth, and there was troubled pleasure, the juxtaposition here between trouble and pleasure creating an unnerving atmosphere as this poem opens. It then develops with this growing sense of fear and awe. The anaphora, remember that's where a certain phrase is from earlier on in the poem is repeated. So the anaphora here really amplifies that kind of growing sense of fear and awe. The adjective craggy is used to describe the mountains surrounding the lake, and again emphasizes that unknown danger that's hidden within these mountains. The idea of the boundary, horizon's utmost boundary, is repeated then with the horizon's bound, and that's coupled with the grey sky being far above, which intensifies the powerless and insignificance felt by the speaker, those strong feelings of the vulnerability that he feels when he's out in nature are really important. And these strong feelings continue as the poem moves on. The feelings of fear and awe being amplified through the semantic field of size. The towering mountains are repeatedly described as huge, a huge peak, black and huge. And that's kind of coupled with these adjectives of being black and grim, which intensify the terror that the speaker feels at this point. He's in a tiny little boat in the middle of a lake surrounded by mountains, and the sheer size and dominance of the scenery leaves him with trembling oars. So really amplifying those strong feelings of fear and terror as he just realizes, kind of the insignificance of human life amongst this sublime mountainous scene. As the poem concludes then, the speaker reflects on the experience and narrates how this sublime encounter with nature dominates his consciousness, both by day and in his dreams at night. So he describes this grave and serious mood, the solitude, the darkness, the blank desertions, and how they were a trouble to his dreams, the anaphora, because earlier in the poem, when we looked at how the ideas were further established, we talked about the troubled pleasure, and now we've got a trouble to my dreams. So that sense of the foreshadowing that was there at the start comes to fruition as the poem concludes. The repetition of the determiner no, when he narrates how there were no familiar shapes, no pleasant images of trees, no colours of green fields, really contrasts that serene peacefulness from the start. And that has been replaced by these huge and mighty forms, which, a bit like Cousin Kate, creates this kind of sinister ending to the poem. There's this sense of I was content. So both poems open with this idea of contentness, the summer's evening. In Cousin Kate, she was living that rural pastoral life. Here we've got the summer evening and the willow tree. So both starting with a sense of calm and peacefulness, developing through different emotions before concluding with quite a sinister ending. So this is one of the reasons that I've linked these two poems, is they've both got that kind of sense of development from the feelings of safety and security in a simple life to things that are bigger than them, things that operate outside of their control. With Cousin Kate, it's the fact that the Lord has this power and dominance over her. In extract from the Prelude, the speaker feels the dominance and power that nature has over him. So both poems exploring those ideas of powerlessness, just in slightly different ways. Just thinking about the context of this poem, like we did with Cousin Kate. So this is slightly earlier than Cousin Kate was writing. William Wordsworth was born and raised in the Lake District, which if you haven't been, I know a lot of you geographers have recently come back from your Lake District trip. It's a beautiful natural area of the UK, and Wordsworth was really heavily influenced by this. He did live in France for a while, but returned to the UK and got married and became the poet laureate. So this poem is an extract from his autobiographical poem, which comes in 14 books. It's absolutely enormous. And it was all written in iambic pentameter and really kind of reflects and is rooted in that formative experiences that he had as a child and adolescent in the Lake District. He did have a very troubled childhood. He actually lost both of his parents when he was quite young, and so he spent a lot of time outside to try and escape from the very difficult family circumstances he found himself in. Wordsworth writes as part of the Romantic movement, capital R, because we're looking at something like the Gothic. This is the Romantic period, which is characterised by its emphasis on emotions. It tends to glorify nature and past events. Memories and settings are often colourfully described, and it's partially in response to the scientific rationalisation of nature in the era. So we're looking at just prior to the Industrial Revolution as kind of innovation and technology were really beginning to advance. So some interesting kind of contextual ideas there to reflect upon, linking to this idea of the importance of nature and that natural life. For this question then, you have around 30 minutes of writing time. If you have extra time, that's around 36 minutes. And use that EDAC structure together. So look at how both poems initially establish those strong feelings. What do they do? What do they establish? How do they do this? Are there similarities or differences that you can recognise between them? A caveat to that, if you're writing about one thing, it doesn't have to be similar in the other one. So, you know, you can look at how they do things differently. That's absolutely fine. Thinking about the techniques that they use, again, they don't have to be the same techniques. They can be different. And perhaps think about how they link their ideas to the context in which the poems are written. Think then about how each poem develops these ideas. Do they both continue in the same way? Do they develop differently? What do the writers do? Think about where those strong feelings are amplified in each of the poems. Are there similar techniques that are used? Are they different? Again, you don't have to talk about the same thing in both poems. They can be different. That's absolutely fine. And then think about how the poems conclude. So I showed you in the video how I was linking extract from the Prelude to Cousin Kate, thinking about how both poems initially began with that kind of calm, serene, happy, contented atmosphere at the start, and how both of the poems end with quite a sinister, malevolent tone where the powerlessness of the speaker is really brought to the forefront of the poem and how that reflects those contexts of the time. So think about using those ideas. We've looked at the poems separately in this video, so you can now go through and have a go at writing. Good luck.